So a very, very warm welcome everybody to the first seminar in our Rural Health Seminar series for 2021. My name's Jo Longman. I'm a researcher at the University Centre for Rural Health, which is part of the University of Sydney, and I'm based in Lismore on the beautiful far north coast. And I know that we have people registered to attend the event today who are from all over. So a very, very warm welcome everybody to this seminar. Thank you so much for coming. So I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodianship of the country on which we're meeting and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging who have cared for and continue to care for country. So a little bit of housekeeping for everybody who's on this Zoom today. First of all, can you please keep your microphone muted? It just helps us hugely with any background noise situations. And I wanted to let you know that this seminar is being video and audio recorded, and we've already had several requests, Sally, for a copy of this seminar. Some people who originally had registered and then said they couldn't come, so they've already asked for the recording, so that's great. And just to give you the heads up that there will be time for questions at the end of the presentation. We're thinking it's probably best, because there's lots of people coming to this seminar today, to use the chat function to ask questions, or you could try unmuting and asking a question. We might have to see how that works in practice, but do feel free to use the chat function, and we will be monitoring the chat function as we go along. So just to let you know that the next seminar, which will be next month, on Thursday the 18th of March at the same time, so 4 to 5 p.m, we're really delighted that David Rowland is coming to give that seminar, and he's going to talk about post-traumatic growth. David is author of a recent book that you can see there called The Power of Suffering, Growing Through Life Crises. And I think that's going to be a really interesting seminar. So that's happening next month, if you want to put that in your diaries for Thursday the 18th. Okay, so on to the main business of today. I'm absolutely thrilled to be introducing you to Dr. Sally Gillespie. Sally's going to be talking on climate engagement, psychological challenges and community conversations. So Sally has worked as a Jungian psychotherapist for over 20 years before she did her doctoral research. And she looked into the psychological experience of ongoing climate engagement. And after completing her PhD at Western Sydney Uni, she lectured in eco-psychology and cultural change for the Masters in Social Ecology there, and also facilitated workshops on climate psychology for campaigners. In addition to writing a number of book chapters, Sally is the author of a book called Climate Crisis and Consciousness, Reimagining Our World and Ourselves. And that book explores the psychological challenges and developmental processes of climate engagement for individuals and societies. And I can highly recommend you read the book. Sally is a member of Psychology for a Safe Climate and also the Climate Psychology Alliance. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing my screen now, Sally, and hand over to you. Thank you so much for coming today to give this seminar. Thanks, everyone.
So, hello, everyone. I'm delighted to be here. Thank you, Jo. So, look, I'm talking today from a basis of doctoral research I did starting some 10 years ago. And I did this research because I was a psychotherapist who was getting increasingly interested in the psychological dimensions of the way people engage with climate change. And I started to have a question, which of course was very personal, which is what is going to happen for me and others like me as we become more and more engaged. There was a lot of questions about denial at the time, but I wanted to know what's the trajectory of development that people go on as they become more ongoingly engaged with climate and especially become very committed to acting upon it. So I'm going to have to ask you to move the slideshow, Jo, if you go to the next slide. I went about doing this research by setting up a year-long discussion group And the people who attended the group were all very engaged with climate issues already. And they volunteered because they welcomed the opportunity to talk about what that was like for them psychologically and emotionally. And I was part of the group. It was a collaborative inquiry. And I guess what really came out of it that was so surprising, I mean, I thought it would be, you know, a really interesting discussion, but I had no idea of the depth and the richness of the discussion.
Okay, so we're looking at your second slide, Sally, the fantastic, okay. We just had a slight discussion amongst ourselves about how intriguing this map is.
Well, yes, thank you. And I really love that it paid tribute to the depth of discussions. And really why I'm sharing it here is just because it's really the basis of why I now am so passionate around dialogue circles, talking circles, sharing circles around responding to climate and ecological crisis, because I'm aware of how much people have to say, and in order to say it, we need that space to sit and really being able to think and feel down into it. If you bring the next slide up, Joe. What came out of this is just some of the findings that came out, but certainly one thing that was very clear to everyone in the group is that we all felt a lot better for participating in this discussion groups. People typically came in feeling isolated. Some felt more despairing than others, but through being able to talk at this depth, we felt we built up resilience and emotional well-being, and most importantly, felt more able to engage. So really what came out of that is these exploratory conversations carried out in a safe way, which means listening carefully, not going into debate, staying away somewhat from politics and the science, which, you know, tend to be the main area of debate in the public, that we were able to not only become more resilient, but it helped us to work through new worldviews and the implications of that. And many people commented they felt a bit more grown up. It's like being able to sift through all those implications really helped us to think a lot about what our responsibilities were, what our ethics were, what our values were as they were developing in response to the crisis. And also to make the point that the conversations were deep because it went beyond the intellectual. We did not only share how we felt, we shared stories and anecdotes, we shared dreams, and so on. And I think this is a very important part of how we need to go into the deeper levels, to go through the amount of transition we really need to go through in order to be able to engage with the climate crisis. So one of the questions is, if these conversations are so rich, why are we not having them more? Next slide, Joe. And I think these are a few things that came to me around this, and you might have some more ideas you want to share. One is, of course, a very emotionally provocative area to talk about how we do feel in response to climate crisis, especially as it intensifies and as we are progressively going through more lived experience of it. We are not a very emotionally expressive culture, and here I'm talking about the kind of Western Anglo-influenced culture. And of course that varies a lot from different communities, but I think in terms of the public discourse in Australia, that certainly has an effect. Also at a deeper level, climate crisis is an existential threat. It stirs death anxieties, and we are, again, I'm talking mainstream Western culture here, a death-phobic culture. And we don't have good ways of collectively grieving or honouring death as part of life. So there's been a lot of work done about how consumerism has become a bit of an immortality project because, you know, because we're not really facing into the fact we're all going to die and that life is built upon death as well as birth. There are various ways that we're trying to hold on to a sense of our own importance and ongoing existence. It would be great if what we held on to was building up an ecological heritage, you know, and I think there's tremendous opportunity for that here now, that our legacy in life could be to restore and look after degraded ecological systems, and indeed to protect ongoing generations from the kind of climate catastrophes that we see on the horizon. But it takes a great shift from where the consumer culture has been going, which has been about developing a sense of status and eternal existence through materialism. Also, Tim Walton has termed this term hyperobject, which some of you may know, in terms of climate change, really saying that it actually is so huge, a concept, and its consequences are so far-reaching that it's very hard for us to find the language and the thought processes as well as articulate the emotional responses. So we need time and space to be able to talk about climate distress, and we need to also to feel safe, which means we need to feel that we will be well listened to. But of course, in sharing with others how we feel, then we start to feel a lot less isolated, because we realise our feelings are not personal as much as collective in many ways. Next slide. The other thing about talking about climate at a deeper level is it challenges the paradigms which mainstream modernist societies have been built on in the Western world. And one of that is this idea that we are separate to, as a human species, we are separate to and disconnected from the natural world. And there's various discussions about where that separation was made, and you can go quite far back, as well as look around the Enlightenment and so on. I won't go more into that. I think neoliberal framings make engaging with climate difficult, because basically neoliberalism is not grounded in ecological principles, and in fact it's grounded on using the earth up. And it also tends to frame people outside of social structures, an individualistic kind of a framework, as well as emphasising ongoing economic growth, individuals as consumers and bystanders rather than engaged citizens, and so on. The scientific framings, of course, are vital to understanding climate change, but sometimes if we stay within those framings, it makes it difficult to explore the deeper implications of where the climate crisis has come from at the social and political levels, and how we need to respond to it, and particularly in really understand the kind of systemic change that we are needing. So we need to be able to take climate change discussions outside of the science and politics. I mean, obviously they're a huge part of it and we need those discussions, but we need to go beyond them in order to acknowledge the psychological and the philosophical and spiritual dimensions of the crisis. Okay, next slide, Jo. So reflective climate crisis. We really, many people do fear going into talking about how they feel, and you'll often be in a conversation where it might be raised up and someone makes a quick joke or deflects in some way. I think that's getting less. It's certainly less than when I did my research, but I think it does take someone feeling a little bit able to provide a little bit of leadership here, or you know, modeling some good listening, and as well as sharing our own feelings. So what I'm saying is, instead of allowing that back off, is to actually encourage the feelings to get expressed, and often that means taking the lead ourselves once we understand how important it is, because when we don't talk about it, it feeds feelings of isolation and disempowerment, which is not what we want. So often people talk about, well, why is everyone so apathetic about climate? Well, I don't know if people really are apathetic as much as it's kind of a numbness and a sense of overwhelm that's masking feelings of sadness, despair, grief, and so on. And so we need to get underneath there. There's this lovely quote from Edward Lear, who wrote a wonderful book called Radical Hope. It says, perhaps if we could give a name to our shared sense of vulnerability, we could find better ways to live with it. And I think that's often the elephant in the room. And we need to talk about vulnerability, just as we need to talk about what we're losing. We need to talk about our various fears of what not only we might be losing personally, but what our children and grandchildren, what's being lost at so many levels, as well as the very, obvious ecological losses. And yes, okay. And next slide, Jo. So the conversations that tend to transform how we feel, as well as how we engage and how we act, are conversations where we can really reflect on what climate change means to us, as well as how we feel about it. And in doing that, it helps us to both accept the crisis is real and urgent, and to process trauma. A lot of the times when we hear about climate crisis, we see the graphs, we see the statistics, it's quite traumatizing. And there's often very little space given to acknowledging that, let alone processing that. And certainly, I think it's really important for people who do present climate information to have a little bit more acknowledgement in their presentations about the kind of feelings it stirs up, or even just pausing sometimes to give people to have a little discussion with their neighbour, or just name some of the feelings. It really makes an enormous difference. I have a climate scientist friend who does this in his presentations, and it really makes a difference to how much the audience can engage. We can grieve together, and we can develop empathy. It's also a time to be able to listen to insights from other people and cultures. We tend to get caught up into a kind of a mainstream commentary, which is very caught in its own paradigm, so we need to get out of that. And it helps us to really bring up deep-seated assumptions and examine them in a non-threatening way, and imagine different ways of living and different forms of connecting. And this is all part of developing a psychological maturity grounded in ecological knowledge and systemic awareness. Next. It's particularly important, there's now a lot of community conversations going on about responding to climate or recovering from climate events such as bushfires in the area where I'm visiting now. It's very strong. And I really want to encourage that when the community does get together around these areas, that there is some space for conversations again about how people are feeling. It's a very important way of countering polarization and projection. So rather than arguing about I'm for this or against that, is, well, how do we feel about where our home, where we live, what's important to us, what we value about the place and the community. It's a time to invite in traditional ecological knowledge from the traditional owners. And it's a time of, strengthening that network of understandings and possibilities for action. So that's what I really want to encourage in terms of community, that there's space and time given for people to share stories and really to listen to one another before rushing into, okay, we've got to do this action or that action. We need that shared understanding to come up with very solid forms of action and commitment. Next, Jo. Grief and hope. These are often really difficult points for people who are very engaged with climate, about the grieving, which seems, and in many ways does not have any resolution. It's not like losing someone and you go through a process of grief and then you move on. It's an ongoing process of loss when we're dealing with ecological crisis. And it's not only the ecological losses, it's also the kind of personal losses of things that we have assumed about our lifestyle or our beliefs and values and identity. That's all getting changed as the crisis becomes more and more evident. And the grief that we feel there is often disenfranchised. I think particularly when the business as usual narrative is strongly pushed. We feel that possibilities of, and of course we're familiar with this from COVID in the last year, that many possibilities of living had to get pulled back. And while there's hope that we might go back to what we call normal, it's more likely that we're going back. We weren't not going back, but we're in a change kind of time, and there are losses there, and that's so true with the climate. And we need to talk about those losses and say, yeah, it's hard. I'd love to go have a trip to Europe but it's not that simple anymore. I have to think about my responsibilities there and the kind of carbon footprint that form of overseas travel involves. Now, grief can manifest through a whole range of feelings. Many people will be aware of the Kubler-Ross model, talks about denial, anger, sadness, and so on. I also make the point that grief is dynamic, and that while we go through a whole range of feelings, part of that comes off to a sense of acceptance of loss. That in feeling what we're feeling, we're going through a process of accepting the loss. And we're also thinking, well, if this loss has happened, how is our world now? And what can we commit to from what we've learned about the loss or how we feel about the loss? 4 tasks of grief: acceptance, working through the feelings, adjusting to the new reality, and reinvesting energy into the world as it is now, is a continuous cycle in terms of working with climate crisis. Grief and hope are not mutually exclusive. We can acknowledge loss while also taking from that loss what is so valuable and what is so important, and recommitting and investing more care and more time into repair and renewal. Next slide, Joe. Shared grieving is extremely important. This is a collective loss. We should not be grieving alone. We should be grieving with others. And it can be often in simple rituals, going to a wounded place, going to a place where there has been damage, to bear witness. The various memorials, artists, I think, and writers are a very strong part of this. A shared silence, remembering, and so on. Talking circles, I think, are very important, and a big part, I think, of how communities are coming together in terms of reflecting on bushfire loss, and they deepen the compassion. And there's various people who are increasingly offering groups work that reconnects, and psychology for a safe climate are several examples, and I've got links for them at the end of the talk. Yeah. Thank you, Joe. Next slide. Oh, here we are. So people are increasingly in response to climate talking about either grounded hope or radical hope or active hope. And they're all dealing with this idea that hope is not so much, this is hope which is not built on what outcome is likely, but it's built on a commitment to protecting life. And we learn in this process to hold the tension between optimism and pessimism, to understand that we will get waves of both, and at the same time to be able to hold a vision of our desired future. We cultivate active hope or grounded hope by accepting that it's necessary and normal to feel this emotional ebb and flow, which accompanies ecological loss and change and climate engagement. And we can strengthen our hope through feeling gratitude for what is here, particularly, I think, in the natural world, our joy in the natural world, and inspiration, and reimagining our ideals and our identifications. This is really talking about a radical reworking of how we understand ourselves and our lives, and what we're here to do and what we can do with our lives. And this builds psychological resilience and compassion and maturity. And I love this quote from Vaclav Havel: "Hope is not a prognostication, it is an orientation of the spirit, an orientation of the heart." So I won't talk too much about burnout. I think people know about burnout and what it is at a personal level. There's a number of symptoms there. And also to make the point that while you may be in an okay space, sometimes organisations or the groups you're working with can get burnt out. And so the thought of one more meeting or any more activity becomes unbearable. It's so important that in working with climate issues, which are ongoing and confronting in so many ways, that we take care of ourselves, and that we understand that this is a process of sustainability and regeneration at a psychological level, just as we want to bring this to the world. Next slide, Joe. This is, look, I'll just point you to the research by Roe Randall and Paul Hoggett. They compared climate activists and climate scientists in terms of looking at psychological resilience. And what came out is that long-term climate activists actually were doing very well. And that's because they developed emotionally supportive cultures for their long-term commitment. They had a bit of a dynamic trajectory where they'd understand they'd get very immersed in something and that could come into a bit of a crisis of overwhelm, and that they need to come back and find a way of resolving this so they can work ongoingly. And so that means finding perspective, being realistic, managing the exposure, amount of time you spend on climate issues during your day, during your week, and ways of processing emotions through particularly peer group support. And sharing circles and so on, and a real sense that this was a way of working together. Climate scientists did not do so well because they did not have the same sense of professional supports, and often felt, in fact, very under attack from organisations they might be working in, or the media, or so on. And so they were lacking support and reflective spaces to work through the considerable ethical and emotional challenges that come to them. So we need to learn from the climate activists, and also be encouraged that there is a way of being active, being engaged ongoingly, which actually leaves you more psychologically resilient and more creative in response to the work. But warning, we're all very susceptible to speed. It's part of the contemporary mainstream culture. It's the enemy of healthy ecosystems, and it's the enemy of our own healthy well-being. And it can sometimes be a bit of a way of responding to when a lot of feelings are coming up. We need to learn then to slow down and process and talk and reflect with others. Next slide, Jo. Look, I won't go through all of these. I think a lot of you know what you need to do for repair and renewal. It's about committing to it and understanding the absolute vital importance of it. I do want to draw attention to creating an inspiring narrative connected to a passion. We need, it's very important to know what your narrative is about climate and your place in it. And to look at creating one which is grounded in that act of hope or radical hope. It doesn't depend on having the best of outcomes, but you're working towards the kind of world you want to be in, and that you are aware of the regenerative and restorative capacities here for both human cultures and ecosystems, and support and conversations, building and restorative time. I'm just going to move through to the conclusion now, Jo. So we need to proceed ecologically. Ecosystems seek renewal of life in whatever way possible. It's essential that we learn to recognise and support ecological processes of interdependence, adaptation, repair and renewal at work in ourselves and our communities, as well as in our world. So some of what we need to meet the challenges at a psychological level is individual support and resources. But the greater work is building community and connection, and a lively creative cultural engagement through reflective conversations and dialogues. And there's a final slide there you might want to put up, Jo, which is just some resources there, some websites where you might find some opportunities to participate in reflective conversations or grief workshops. So they're more and more available, but also, and perhaps we might discuss this now, I don't know how we're going with time, how you might set this up within your own social circle or workplace or activist group or whatever, reading group, there's all sorts of ways we can do this. So, questions? What's our time like, Jo?
Yeah, we're going well, actually.
Oh,
we've got 20 minutes or more for discussion. So yeah, I can't actually see the chat because I'm sharing my screen. So I think I might stop sharing my screen for the minute and see if there's anything on. No, there's nothing much in the chat right now. Okay. So, Annie, did I see you with your hand up? Kath Kelly's got a hand up. Okay, so if people want to try unmuting, we'll see how that goes.
Okay. Thank you so much, Sally, and thank you, Jo, for organising this. It's really, really good. I have a question to you, Sally, about having been through that really deep dive with that group of people that informed your research and your writing, what can you say about the type of foundation that a therapist needs to address these issues in a client? And the reason I ask is because I have experienced, I have been an activist, a campaigner for many years. And I'm normally very resilient, but after the bushfires, I experienced about 18 months of depression. And I was looking for a therapist. And first of all, I couldn't find one where I live. And I couldn't find where to find one. And then I didn't want to go to any old psychologist who may or may not accept climate science. And then I went to a therapist who was kind of good at what they did. I had 2 sessions, but then after a while in the second session, they wanted to go down this route of how is your relationship with your father involved in this? And because I'm an assertive person, I was able to say, no, that is completely not relevant. And I could see how this, she was well-meaning and a good person, but I could see how her frame was an individualistic one, and she was, I sensed, didn't know where to go with this big issue. I suspect because she hasn't done the deep dive that you're talking about. I wonder if you could comment on that.
Yes, thank you. That's a great question, Annie. And it is very true. It is very difficult for a therapist to accompany you through that deep dive when they haven't been through it themselves. This is totally new territory, what we're facing with this existential crisis. So we do need therapists who have both that commitment and that experience within themselves, as well as the training to hold this. And this is a growing thing. Psychology for a Safe Climate is putting together a list of people, so they're the best people to contact these days, especially if you can now do therapy online more. But yeah, it is very hard for a therapist to hold this. And this is when I was talking about, climate crisis challenges the paradigm, and it challenges the paradigm of the therapist too. And so that's what you found with the therapist who wanted to go back to her familiar paradigm of the family dynamic. And also, while we may need one-to-one when we're particularly burnt out or grieving or just, despair or whatever, a lot of the therapy work we need is in a group and community level, because what we're feeling in so many cases is collective and is shared. Now, obviously, as I said, if you've been through a particularly grueling time as an activist and there's been issues within the group and so on, you may need one-to-one for some of that. But we also need to be developing a very different form of community psychology. And some of this also needs to be about anticipatory, and so there's now a lot of work that's coming out of the States about building up resilience in communities ahead of when the various crises or catastrophes hit, so that the community is in a better shape to not only come through those things, but to be proactive in its work. So what I would say in terms of therapy is be persistent in finding the right therapist.
Thanks, Sally. Thank you.
Yeah.
Ruth, did you want to add to that discussion?
Sure. Yeah. Hi, Annie. That reminds me of a book, James Hillman, in I think it was like 1992, because eco-psychology has been around for some time, but he wrote a book called 100 Years of Psychotherapy and the World's Only Getting Worse. And he describes this scene in his book about like the client who gets stuck in traffic on the way to see their psychotherapist, and around them they see homeless people, and they encounter a number of things out in the world on the way to see the psychotherapist. And they get into the psychotherapist's office, and the psychotherapist wants to talk about their mother, and they're like, wait, no, I don't want to talk about my mother. I want to talk about the poverty I just saw, and I want to talk about the environmental destruction and this and that. And he makes a really strong case in this book that psychotherapy had gone down the wrong road until that time, and that what the client needs is to be affirmed in their feelings, and to know that their anger and their grief and the feelings that Sally just talked about, that those are real feelings, and to have them validated by the therapist. So
Absolutely.
yeah, you might want to check out. I have a copy of that book, Annie, if you want to borrow it.
It's a great book.
Mm.
Okay, Sally, we've had a few requests. People would really like to hear you talk a little bit more about the map.
Sure.
So is everybody okay if I'll share the screen again and show the map, and maybe Sally, you could talk for a few moments.
Sure.
To the map.
So what happened at the end of the group, I wanted a way to present to the group some idea of how I had recorded all these conversations and the sense of what we'd talked about. And it was so huge, the range of conversations. I needed to find some way to hold that. And I chose the image of the world because I felt we were very much dealing with a whole new experience of the world as we took in more and more depths around the reality of the climate changing and climate crisis, ecological crisis. So I drew this imaginary world as if we were discoverers. And in the discovering the world, we're naming the feelings, we're naming the philosophical kind of and spiritual revolutions. The continents were the major topics of discussion, and you probably can read them in black. And I put for two poles, the knowing pole and the values pole, because it felt like what we knew, how we knew things, and what we valued were fundamentally changing. And that sort of changed everything around the whole global scenario of how we understood our lives and our ways of engaging with the world. Within each continent, and you won't be able to read this, there's peaks and bays and peninsulas, and they're all named with phrases that we used during our conversations. They came off there. I think there was Breaking Point, I remember. There was Mount Denial. There was all kinds of different things that we were able to name and explore. And then I put in a worldview equator, and there was a tropic of different paradigms, some of which I alluded to before, like the neoliberal paradigm or the Enlightenment paradigm. And the other was tropic of myth, more things to do with a kind of a mythic understanding of our cultures that were changing as a result of the climate changing. And so, this is where we have a sense that we're moving, out of Enlightenment views, and we might talk about the views of Anthropocene, which is a very contested word, but or a ecological worldview and so on. So all of that's there. There's phrases in the ocean, and that's actually from shared dreams. Because I'm a depth psychologist, I was very interested to let the unconscious speak at times, and I invited people to share dreams that felt connected to the topic, and they did. We've got a few nightmares out there, which I think was good to be able to name some of those deepest fears, and so they're in the oceans. So that's to talk about the map. That meant a lot to the group. It felt like they could find a container, a way of holding all these different thoughts and feelings and processes that we had been able to share in the group, and to hold it in a place and to name it as this kind of immense changing of the world and our way of being in the world.
Does anyone have any specific questions? If you want to come off mute to ask Sally specific questions about the map. Okay, that doesn't sound like it. Thank you so much, Sally. I'm just going to stop sharing my screen again.
I just want to say thank you. I've just made a comment that I've altered by actually coming onto this. Normally, I don't go anywhere near something to do with this because I'm not in my comfort zone. It's not, I'm of a very pragmatic nature, being a farmer, that climate is changing all the time. And how do we as humans think that we're going to be able to do very much about it? But I'm also very aware of my grandchildren and great-grandchildren, and we need to be doing something. So I just thank you for your balanced approach. I love that world map. I've taken a photo of it on my screen so that I can look at it a bit larger and a bit more detailed. So thank you again. I've really appreciated what you've had to offer today.
Thank you so much for that feedback and for being here. I really appreciate it. Thank you. And here's to more conversations.
So Sally, I have a question. If nobody, oh, hang on. Somebody had their hand up. Yes. I'm sorry, I can't see your name from here. Hi.
Hi, I'm Kath Kelly, living
Hi, Kelly.
on the Middle Coast. I'm a coral reef ecologist. So I'm one of the ones with the scientific background and, you know, have been watching the slow degradation of the Great Barrier Reef and other reefs around the world. And it is a really, really depressing place to be. And I would say that most coral reef ecologists around the world are quite depressed. And I've recently been involved. I know Bruce Naylor's on this chat. I noticed he asked to comment for the slides, which is great. He's from Osgreen, and I've been involved in a community resilience program for people in my area in the Mid-North Coast, and we've been meeting once a month, and there's been several different topics. And it's very timely and interesting because last night, or Tuesday night, I suggested that one of the things that wasn't included in the program is the psychological welfare and the psychological well-being of people that are facing, you know, as we face climate change on a daily basis. So it was really timely, and I'd just like to say thank you. And I've taken a lot of notes and your references, and yeah, I'll look into it more, because I think that the psychological well-being of people in general. I mean, I live in a rainforest now, and similar, you know, and subject to the climate changes, that it's really difficult to know how to respond a lot of the time. I can't even really predict the weather anymore.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
Yeah.
And
so
I'd just like to thank you, and I'd just like to pay tribute to you, Kath, to you and your colleagues, because climate scientists, that you're right on the front of facing what so much is not being faced within the mainstream culture. And that means that the emotional load it can get very heavy upon you. And I really want to encourage climate scientists to look at calling in psychological resources and help and support. Hopefully we're moving to a place where everyone is getting engaged. And so it's not just that some people are highly engaged and therefore highly aware and bearing a lot of the emotional burden of that. But I think particularly for climate scientists, where often there is quite a high rate of burnout, of people leaving the field because they find it so hard to stay there. It's vital we get more support and resources in there, and it's vital that the groups and organisations that you work within look at ways of really integrating this within the work. I know there's been a great website put out, The Lonely Conservationist, and she's doing, I'm just trying to remember the name, Jess is doing great work there, providing support for conservationists, particularly around this. And just that relief of knowing you're not alone in what you're feeling, and how much support and relief can come from collaborative ways of being with this. And giving that space.
Yeah, it has been great being involved in this Osgreen initiative, which is geared towards community resilience, because I certainly feel a bit more connected with some people that live in my area that I haven't met before, and certainly engaging in conversation and sharing ideas is really helpful. So thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Sally, there's a question in the chat. I'll read it to you. It's from Marilee Campbell. She says, I'd love to know how you go about delivering therapy to groups on climate topics. I work in drought-affected communities, and there is so much need for mental health support. But as soon as you say the word therapy or mental health, people who need it most won't go.
No, well, that's right, they won't. And I think there's, in some ways, rather than being too categorical, so that you have the mental health presentation, and I'm not saying anything wrong with that, we need those, that we also have something which might sound a lot more inviting and informal, like, how are you doing? How are you doing? Get together. And even very simple facilitations, people are actually really ready to speak, but they just need that sense of invitation, permission, and safety. And the safety is knowing that people will be heard and that there won't be, interrupted, debated with. And so that's why sharing circles where each person just takes a turn perhaps and saying, look, this is how I'm doing. And I think if, you know, often people, you might feel you need a psychologist or social worker there or someone just to hold the space, but it's not like there to do therapy. It's actually there to connect and to build up a network of understandings about how people are feeling. And it's amazing how transformational that acknowledgement, expression and acknowledgement can be. So it doesn't always have to be framed as a mental health intervention as such, or a mental health strategy. We have need for that. This is something we also need, which I think could be done in a slightly less formal way, which might be more inviting for people as a form of connection. Conversation.
Thank you, Sally. And there's lots of comments in this chat coming through. There's somebody making comments about the person-plant relationship for wellness, especially the mental health value of people engaging in green space that they cultivate, and whether we have any resources that we could recommend to explore this, which I'm sure we have. So do you want to say something about that, Sally? And maybe we'll contact people afterwards with some
Sure.
resources. We'll send the resource information.
I have stacks of resources because I'm so fascinated by this, but we're getting so much research out now that is just showing how vital it is for our well-being to be connected to the outdoor living world. And that doesn't mean necessarily you have to head out to National Park. It's great if you can get there, but it means we need living thing. We need to feel the living world within our daily life. And that means stepping outside. It means sometimes having plants inside. Horticultural therapy is huge, but we're really understanding that there's a tremendous illness that has happened within our psyche as well as within our world and our societies from having become so disconnected and separated off from experiencing the natural living world. I mean, we know the natural living world is everything. It's us. We're here all the time. But obviously it's easier to connect to a growing plant than it is to a constructed desk, perhaps. It's really important that we have this, and it's really important from the age of 0. So it's a major thing we need to think about in terms of education. And the more we think about outdoor bush education, the more we are preparing our children for the world that is here and coming.
Okay, well, thank you. Are there any more questions or thoughts? Some of the things in the chat are around people wanting the slides and so forth. So we'll get on to that. And if you look in the chat, you'll see that there's an email address for Tara, who is fantastically supportive for us with these seminars. Thank you, Tara. So if you want to send an email to Tara, so she's got your email address, she'll be able to send
I'm happy to respond to any requests people want to send to me. I've got various links I can send if people want to know more about the research or whatever.
Fantastic. Oh, Annie's got another question. Yeah.
I have observed over many years of working with communities around Australia that there is a collateral well-being that happens from collective action. And so I actually think the isolation of people, and that they haven't yet discovered they haven't discovered how to work with others in a problem-solving way. I mean, obviously there are people doing tremendous work in that way, and I'm not talking about those, but I think there are a lot of people who are worried about the destructive path we're on, and anxious and disturbed, deeply disturbed by it. And I can't see how people can achieve well-being unless there is some discovery of working with other people to solve problems, and there's a lot of well-being that comes from that.
I totally agree, Annie. You know, yes, we need to have more conversations, and those conversations need to lead to action. And when we're in action, we need to have space for conversations as we go through the action. So it needs to be an integrated kind of a cycle. But yeah, I totally agree. And the kind of work that I know you have done up there in Lismore, you will have seen over and over again. And I think you have observed, you know, through all your writings, that going through the kind of action like you had in Bentley, and how that kind of connection helped go with the response to the floods and so on. So I think we have to really look at how our mainstream culture does isolate us, and the need that's bubbling under the surface with all that isolation to connect and to act together. And that often it doesn't take that much. It just takes someone who will provide the leadership, or a group who will provide that container to bring people together and to generate those kind of ideas, and to work step by step through that. So, and I think the more that we have crises happening in various communities as a result of climate and COVID's, I put COVID within that because it's a zoonotic disease. It's come out of forest clearing, and it's et cetera, the more we're starting to understand community action, public well-being, and all of those kinds of things, and a kind of a welling up of a need to get together and work and act with others.
Okay, everyone. Well, I'm going to have to call a close to that because we've nearly run out of time, Sally. So thank you so much, everybody, for coming along this afternoon. And thank you so much, Sally. That was a brilliant presentation. It was so interesting.